In retrospect, few people will look on the harem genre fondly. Filled with sloppy writing and cheap cliches, the genre has become little more than a footnote in slice-of-life and isekai stories. But in 2008, one story took the trends plaguing the harem genre and flipped them on their head. Through the art of subversion, The World God Only Knows became a great commentary about the problems of the genre and simultaneously a legitimately heartwarming story about the importance of relationships in our daily lives. Almost 2 years ago, I made my first video about The World God Only Knows and how its use of subversion elevates it far past the typical guilty pleasure trash that you find in the rest of the harem genre. But, as I said in that video, I didn't cover everything. Season 3 of the anime isn't the end of the story, and as such, there is more story to talk about. For the sake of video quality and honestly for my own sanity, I won't be explaining every single thing that happens after the end of the Goddesses arc. If you want to know everything that happens in the story, then I strongly recommend reading the story yourself. If you haven't heard of The World God Only Knows before, then I also recommend watching my first video talking about it. But for those of you who are still here, let's just dive right into the deep end and talk about the closing act of The World God Only Knows. I call the last third of the story the closing act, but it's important to note that there are multiple arcs that happen throughout this last third of the story. Like many stories, The World God Only Knows can ultimately be divided into 3 parts. The first part is the Conquest arc, which includes all 16 of Keima's original conquests. This arc acts as the exposition for the story, and doesn't have many big story moves relative to its length. The second part is the Goddesses arc, which narrows the story's focus to a select few girls and heavily invests into building up the story. Sticking with the typical writing terminology, it's the rising action. And the climax arc of the story is what I will very creatively call the time loop arc. Want to know why it's called the time loop arc? Here is the timeline from the start of the story until the end of the Goddesses arc. Now, here's a diagram for the time loop arc. Notice that it's a loop. And also notice the 3 broken lines. Those are Keima's unsuccessful loops. Now, time loops are always an interesting idea, but one hard part is to keep tension in the story. The mangaka of this series, Tamaki Wakaki, did a pretty good job at keeping things tense throughout the Goddesses arc. He manages to keep this tension in the time loop arc in 2 ways. The first is that Keima gets a limited number of loops to save the world. The second is that time in the real world seems to progress like normal, which makes Keima's swan song a time-sensitive manner. In addition to Keima only having 4 attempts to save the world, he has no clue what he's supposed to do. This leads to Keima almost immediately failing in the first loop, but he figures out that his first goal is to get this bobcut girl to stop killing herself. He wastes another loop, but succeeds on his 3rd attempt and gets some sort of checkpoint. He makes a lot of progress in this loop, and it reveals most of the story to the audience. I don't want to completely skate over it, so here's the lore. The time loop Keima's stuck in is set in 10 years in the past on Maijima Island, which is the same town where the rest of the story takes place. It turns out that Maijima Island was the battleground for the first major war between Old Hell and the future founders of New Hell. It's also where the seal to Old Hell is located. The final day of the loop, July 22nd, is when a bunch of loose souls break out of Old Hell and begin infesting the world. Keima initially assumes that his job is to stop this from happening, but he's unsuccessful. Right at the end of the 3rd loop, the bobcut girl tells him that he can't come to the Maijima cave in the next loop, and she sends him back for his final loop. The 4th loop is when everything finally connects. The time loop dimension is an invention of Dokuro, one of the most important characters in the story. Essentially, she was the one who founded New Hell and first saved the world from ending. She predicted that Seder, the real group behind Vintage, the main bad guys, would eventually try to overthrow New Hell by resurrecting and controlling the goddesses. To put a stop to this, she created a contingency plan called the Orb and the Watchman. The Orb and the Watchman goes like this. A time loop is set up in a sort of pocket dimension set to Maijima Island, where a bunch of demons manage to break the seal on Old Hell and escape into the human realm. This time loop is only accessible through a certain ritual, but that's not enough security. So she adds in 2 core mechanics, the Orb and the Watchman. We've already talked about the Orb, but to remind you all, it acts... Did we talk about the Orb? No, we didn't. The Orb acts as a guide for the player, glowing whenever they're near a key event. Each of these loops costs Dokuro a lot of energy, so the Orb also displays the number of loops left before her magic runs out. The other mechanic is the Watchman, taking the form of Dokuro's past self. This Watchman is meant to thwart any malicious intervention, causing the entire plan to crumble if the Watchman doesn't approve of the player. It's not quite clear how the first segment of the loops work, but the way that Watchman Dokuro acts throughout the story makes it seem like she's already been enduring this loop for years or even centuries. If Dokuro gets saved by the player, and they manage to convince her that they're capable of saving the world, then she can manually put them into the final loop and assist them in getting their perfect result. But, as Keima wonders throughout the entire arc, what actually is the perfect loop, and how is he supposed to accomplish it? Throughout the arc, Dokuro's power has been able to isolate the time loop from the real world. The final step is to snap the loop into the real timeline like so. We understand most of the time loop's mechanics now, so let's look at what the story accomplishes with them. I don't want to be stuck here forever, so again, let's stick to a few major scenes, mainly near the end of the arc. Our first major scene is during this part of the third loop. Up to this point, Keima has been trying to figure out what he's supposed to change. He initially thought that he was supposed to go back and stop everything from happening. This is a story trope that you see pretty often. The protagonist saves the world or accomplishes his goal, returning the world to complete normality. In Keima's case, it would also erase all of his memories. Keima gets close to accomplishing this initial goal. He's in Maijima Cave right as the devils break free from Old Hell, but the task quickly becomes impossible. In an emotional fight with Dokuro, Keima comes to a realization about his objective in the time loop. The real objective of the time loop is to set up a sort of canon past. Instead of changing everything, he needs it to play out exactly like it already has. The school trip happens like normal, the loose souls escape Old Hell, and they all invade the same girls that Keima's already conquered. He's setting his past self up for success by using his even further in the past self. This is a massive revelation for Keima, but he adapts and makes quick progress. Until we get closer to the end of the fourth loop anyways. To properly highlight this next scene, we need to revisit the first two arcs. The first arc has Keima treating every conquest like a game. After all, it's dating sim games that he excels at, so he finds success in approaching it like a game. The Goddesses arc punishes him for doing this, creating an environment that simply doesn't cater to a game-like mindset. He's pushed to treat the girls not just as game characters, but as real people that he has to honestly interact with. Now, with the time loop arc, he's put right back into an environment that is literally purpose-built to act like a game. He gets retries, he gets an objective tracker, he gets a score tracker, and he has heaps of metadata about the situation at hand. Keima's undoubtedly matured, but he immediately reverts to treating the time loop arc as a game again. He treats the people in the loop as flat characters, and it works well for him for the first few loops. Until this last loop, where he has to deal with Vintage. Essentially, Vintage are the ones who open the holes in the girls' hearts. This means Keima has to undo Vintage's plan, and then redo it himself with the right girls. But Keima can't figure out a way to make progress by himself. He ends up realizing that the only way to make everything work is to bring one more confidant into the fold. That confidant being Tenri. The implications of bringing Tenri into it is massive. Not only would she be helping him in the next loop, but Tenri would remember everything and have to assist Keima for the next 10 years minimum. Keima tries to avoid it so far as to try to reset the loop yet again. But he's so caught up in playing it like a game that he doesn't stop to consider Tenri's feelings. Tenri has always had feelings for Keima, and she's eager to help him. So Keima makes a second realization. Confiding in Tenri is the right choice. Tenri will watch over everything, and she will make sure that every single thing goes exactly according to plan up to the point of the time loop arc. Keima tells everything to Tenri, him being from the future, the literal demons that he's fighting, and the entire plan that they need to follow in the past. This plan hinges on one final encounter with Kaori, whom Keima correctly assumes has a way to sabotage Vintage's plan. He displays his steeled resolve about getting the perfect ending, outclasses her, and everything proceeds perfectly. Finally, Dokuro tells Keima how the loop gets broken. The Goddesses have to summon him back to the real world. They're the ones who snap the timeline into place, and the last job of the orb, which is now almost completely drained of energy, is to communicate his feelings to the Goddesses. We get a heartfelt speech from Dokuro talking about her regrets during the war for Hell and her admiration of Keima. We also learn that she's Miss Nikaido, Keima's high school teacher and one of the first characters we see in the story. After saying goodbye, she runs off to lure Vintage, and Keima prepares for his third and final task of the time loop arc, opening holes in the hearts of his future conquests. Of course, things can't go smoothly. Between a bloody fight in the real world involving Dokuro and the meddling of some wannabe hollows, the summoning device gets broken. Essentially, the goddesses have to all work together to fix the summoning device, but as per usual, Ayumi is the only holdout. Tenri doesn't have many options to win Ayumi over, so she shows her one of the letters that Keima had written about the future. This letter scene is where we get to see Keima's character shine. We get to see just how much he's grown up since the start of the story. First, he talks about each of the goddesses, their personalities, likes, dislikes, and so on. And he talks about how even though he romanced them out of necessity, they're still all his friends and really close to his heart. And then he talks about the mistake he made during the high school festival, and how defeated he felt after being forced to reject Chihiro. He just wanted everything to be over. But when he looked around and saw that everybody else wanted to persevere, he wanted to do the same thing. Ayumi's a little receptive to this, but she's still frustrated. And as Tenri says, Keima has dealt with these same feelings the entire time, and Tenri knows this feeling more than anybody. After all, she's loved him this entire time, and she's been helping and waiting for the present Keima for 10 years now. After hearing about this, Ayumi concedes, and the girls end up combining their powers to repair the timeline device to bring Keima back. The goddesses fix the timeline, 7-year-old Keima is returned to his world, and the goddesses beat back Vintage and the wannabe hollows. And in one of our final scenes, Keima and Elsie talk about their feelings at a table in some sort of pocket dimension. Throughout the last 265 chapters, we've watched these two tag team and complete conquest after conquest and save the world twice. They have been partners the entire time, and seeing them finally talk about their experiences and being glad that they met and worked together is just so damn cathartic. Elsie asks Keima if she can fulfill one last wish, and then the dinner ends as Keima is finally returned to the real world. And thus, we find ourselves at the penultimate chapter. The world is safe, and we see that Elsie's wish was to become Keima's little sister, by his side at all times till the very end. Everything seems to be back to normal, and Keima goes to see Chihiro, where he confesses his love to her, his real love. And he's promptly rejected. And so, the world God only knows approaches its ending. It's still not clean. The girls all still have their memories, everything's messy, Dokuro leaves in a bittersweet farewell, and everybody realizes that their story is coming to an end. Some show determination, others show resignation. Some are just too busy to feel any way about it. One might even show her true feelings to Keima. But for Tenri, her story is, unfortunately, set in stone. Keima will always be by Tenri's side, but as he told her, he can't bring himself to trap her in some sort of predestined fate. She has a right to find her own way through life, just as all of the other girls have to do as well. Until then, it's up to everybody to keep searching for their own answers. Other than Keima and Chihiro at least, they seem to have found theirs. It's been almost 2 years since I last talked about this story, and it's been so long that I kind of forgot just how good it is. And I believe one of the strongest aspects of it is this last arc, for as weird as it is, it's really important and really integral to the story, and I think it sets up a really good ending. Now, in my first video, I focused on the theme of the power of relationships. That theme was including this arc, and I think that those final few scenes display that the best. But there's also the matter of Keima's personal development. The Conquests arc had him using his skills from video games to accomplish real-world change, and to help others find their way in life through the power of a first love. The second arc took those skills and put Keima against a grindstone, forcing him to not only use his skills in a much more harsh environment, but also taking into consideration the ways that he had impacted these girls. It forced him to make tough decisions where there seemed to be no right answer, and he ended up making a mistake that deeply hurt one of the few people who truly loved Keima. He saved the world, but he still wasn't a complete person yet. He had been beaten down by his tribulations, and even if he was victorious, he still felt like he had been defeated. And then the time loop arc starts, and Keima's put into this perfect medium between the previous two arcs. He can make mistakes, but he can only make so many before the world ends. And so again, Keima puts his skills to the test, and through some great collaboration with Elsie, Dokuro, Tenri, and countless others, he's able to weave together the perfect world. A world that isn't actually perfect, but it gives everybody the chance to move on with their lives, discover new loves, and keep on facing challenges head on. And I think that what Keima gains most from this arc is, well, the will to live. He realizes that there's so much more to life than meets the eye, that every person is full of feelings, challenges, regrets, and dreams. His 2D world finally becomes 3D, and I think it's such a good metaphor for a coming-of-age story. I shouldn't have been surprised, but a lot of people were angry or at least didn't like how the story ends, or more specifically, who Keima decides to end the story by choosing. Look, I get the genre norm of having like an open book ending where a girl isn't picked, but The World God Only Knows just isn't a harem story. It's a rom-com turned serious that uses harem elements to set up a great emotional narrative. And as Keima explains near the end, it's just unfair to the girls to let them stay hopeful on the thoughts of a relationship with them. He wants them to go and experience their own lives and find joy in them like he has in his own life. Understandably more contentious is the person Keima actually chose. Now the obvious second choice is Tenri. She's the one who helped him save the world. Aside from Elsie, she's his closest friend and companion, and she's loved Keima from the start. But again, as Keima explains, he doesn't think it's fair to rob Tenri of the possibility of finding her own love. Even if the feelings seem organic, Keima tampered with her life in an unchangeable way, and the best way to take responsibility for that meddling is to just give her an opportunity to regain what she lost, her freedom. And so we're left with the one girl that he did choose, Chihiro. Since the beginning of the story, Chihiro has been the key to its ending. She's an ordinary girl standing among a roster of standouts. She's been a foil to Keima's antics time and time again, ultimately culminating in that second arc. And most importantly, she's the only girl in the story that fell in love with Keima. She didn't fall in love with a persona that Keima made or a glimpse of Keima's future. She loves Keima for who he is during the story. His feelings for Chihiro are the epitome of him growing up as a character and embracing the real world. The real world is impossible to predict. Things won't go your way, you'll make mistakes, and you'll have to deal with tough times. But in spite of that, it's worth living in. And Keima finally realizes that when he made that mistake at the festival. The truth is, Chihiro was always going to be the one for him, and it wasn't decided by Tamaki, or Tamaki's editors, or even the fans. She was the only way to properly complete Keima's character. Sometimes when writing a story, the story kind of writes itself. I mean, obviously the author is still the one putting down the ink or keystrokes, but there's an event horizon where your story begins to take on a life of its own. This is a topic I want to cover by itself due to recent events, but balancing how you want your story to end and how the fans or even the story itself wants to end is a tricky problem. Ending a story is really hard, and there are countless examples of both good and bad endings, but I honestly believe that The World God Only Knows has the perfect ending. It's not the ending that all the fans wanted, and it might not even be the ending that Tamaki wanted, but it was, without a doubt in my mind, the best way it could have ended. Thanks for watching. Hey everybody, so I just woke up from an 8-month-long nap. In all seriousness though, it did not take me 8 months to edit this video, and it will not take me 8 months to upload a video ever again. That being said, thank you all for your extreme patience and also for all of your support on my other videos and the channel in general. It's gotten way bigger than I ever expected, and I thank you all deeply for that. That's about all I have though, so I'll just see you all in the next video. This has been Zompak Bro, and again, thanks for watching.